This morning we continue in our worship theme, Be. And over these few weeks, we're remembering together that it's important not only what we do as followers of Jesus Christ, but it's important who we are as followers of Jesus Christ. Not only the ways in which we act and speak, but in our very motivations and in our orientation toward God and toward people as followers of Christ. In short, the kinds of people that we can be. And as you notice from the bulletin cover today, our focus today is on how important it is for us to be generous, to be oriented toward God and people with a generosity of spirit and a generosity of heart. And to begin our conversation on being generous, we'll read from Luke's Gospel, chapter 12, verses 13 through 21. So I invite you to listen now for the word of the Lord. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But Jesus said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or an arbitrator over you?" And he said to those around, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." And then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and all my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods, laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God." And we're grateful for this portion of the Holy Scriptures. Holy Spirit of God, please move among us and within us. May we hear, may we understand, may we respond in ways that draw us closer to you in love and that enable us better to proclaim the good news and the grace of Jesus Christ in the world around us. And we ask these things in his holy and powerful name. Amen. In the Jonas house, Suzanne and I consider ourselves very blessed to be the parents of 5 children. And they're spaced out from age 20 to age 4, but they're spaced out in a couple of groups. We have our older 3 who call themselves the A1s. They consider themselves the originals. And they are spaced out 5 years apart. There's Grace, and then 4 years later, Brett, and then 1 year later, Micah. So there were moments in their young lives when they were young children with similar interests, with similar desires, and all kind of crowded into 5 years. Then there's a 7-year gap before Sage, and Sage is 4 years older than Josie. So there are times in their lives when they have very similar interests, and you might have noticed from doing the math that there's never been a time in our lives over the past now 16 years since Brett's arrival that we haven't had at least 2 children who were in some ways competing for the same resources, for the same amount of attention, for the same time. And since Brett's arrival 16 years ago, we have not had a moment in our household in which there was not a younger sibling looking up to, but also imitating and emulating and thinking himself or herself every bit as capable as an older sibling. And this leads to some complications along the way. There are those moments when you start to hear an argument in another room, and then that argument escalates into yelling, and sometimes it will escalate into pushing or shoving or wrestling. And so Suzanne and I will look at each other, and one will walk into the room, and usually what we find out has happened is that one has started to play with something, or one has started to pay attention to something. And when the other noticed, the other had to have it too. We'll walk out of that room and tell each other of all the hundreds of toys in this house. Apparently, there's only one right now that anyone wants to play with. It's the only one that matters in this moment, and both of them have to have it right now or someone will explode. And so we usually have to adjudicate that argument by reminding them how important it is to share. As Jesus says in this passage, we find ourselves in that moment being a judge and arbitrator over them, and we have to set up a schedule. You play with it right now for these first 5 minutes. Then the timer will go off and you have it for 5 minutes. And we'll have to figure out some kind of configuration in which both of them can have some opportunity to use that same resource that is a precious commodity in that one given moment, but it will be completely forgotten tomorrow. Sometimes across the years, Suzanne and I have discovered that maybe our enthusiasm or our energy level for being judge and arbitrator has started to diminish. And we'll allow that argument to go a little farther, and we'll hope that they're going to work out that conflict among and between themselves. Maybe we've just gotten too old and too tired to be able to step into every circumstance. But sometimes it will be the case that we're sitting together eating a meal while this is going on in another room. Or we're sitting together watching a TV show while this is going on in another room. Or more often, we're standing together folding clothes while this is going on in another room. Or we're preparing a meal for them to eat while it's going on in another room. And in those instances, it's not at all unusual for both of us to turn our heads in that direction toward that room, and simultaneously, without having to count down, our voices will yell out to them, "Share!" And that's the problem in the first part of this passage that we read together today. To some extent, it's consoling to me, and it's even comforting to me to know that Suzanne and I are not the first ones to have to deal with two children arguing over something at the same time. You're not the first people to have to deal with that in your household. Apparently, it's been with us from the very beginning, and here we are 2,000 years ago, as Jesus is making his way to Jerusalem and passing through this community. This may be the very first time that this man has ever laid eyes on Jesus. It may be the very first time that he's ever been close to Jesus. And in that instant, the very most important thing on his mind is telling Jesus to be judge and arbitrator over his brother. Make him share with me. Boy, I'd like to have $1 for every time I've heard that from one of the 5 Jonas kids. I stop for a moment to think about how tragic this is. If Jesus walked through Maryville today and you had that one opportunity to see Jesus up close and in person, if you had the one opportunity to hear what Jesus had to teach to the world, wouldn't it be tragic if the most important thing on your mind was to invite Jesus into a family squabble to be the referee? But before I'm too insensitive toward this brother who's asking Jesus to make his brother share an inheritance with him, I want to acknowledge that maybe this brother is experiencing injustice. Maybe it's the case that he's talking about an older brother who has inherited not only a larger portion of the family inheritance, but who has also inherited the title of head of household now. The paterfamilia in the language of the Romans. Maybe this older brother has inherited control over the estate as executor and has failed to give his younger brother the portion that was allotted to him. So maybe this is a voice of desperation saying, I've got to have a way to care for my family. Make him do what he rightly should do. On the other hand, maybe this younger brother simply is not happy with his portion of the inheritance. And he's asking Jesus to intervene and to make his older brother give him part of the larger portion that the older brother has inherited. He may simply be asking Jesus, tell him to give me more than I have received. And that would not be unexpected given what Jesus has to say in verse 15. Notice that Jesus says, take care. And if your translation is punctuated in the same way my translation is punctuated, there's probably an exclamation mark after that. Jesus says that in such a way as to catch people's attention. Take care, be careful, watch out. And he goes on to say, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. And there in verse 15, when he says all kinds of greed, Luke, the gospel writer, has used the Greek word pleonexia, that's translated into English as greed. And that comes from the Greek word pleon, which means more. Pleonexia is the condition of always needing or wanting more. It's not being satisfied. It's not being able to acknowledge enough. It's saying, I've got to have more. And it sounds like that might be Jesus' interpretation of what the little brother's up to. It might be that in addition to what he has received, he wants more. And that's the pleonexia, the type of greed against which Jesus is warning this brother. Now, you and I, tragically, have probably experienced this in many of our lives. Unfortunately, when estates are settled, when inheritances are distributed, there are frequently occasions in which people who inherit something want more, are not satisfied with what they inherited. And I've seen this in branches of my own family, in which siblings clustered together and did not talk to other siblings, or siblings clustered together and tried to leverage other siblings because they wanted more than they had received in the estate, thought that someone else should not have received as much. And in that instance, like the brother in this passage, they have valued a resource over a relationship. That's what this brother is doing. Saying to Jesus, make my brother give me this inheritance. I value the resource that I could inherit more than I value my relationship with my brother. Tragically, several years ago in a church that I served, a woman in the church died, and her children lived one adjoining her property on one side of the road and one across the road. And when she distributed their inheritance through her estate, they were not satisfied. And so here were these siblings who had lifelong been siblings, and they'd lived close by each other, and they refused to talk to each other over the estate. They divided their church attendance so that one came to the later service and one came to the early service, so they wouldn't even have to see each other at church. And that was a heartbreaking circumstance because I was pastor to the mother who died and to both of her children who survived. And I remember not long after that having a conversation with my own sister. And I said, if it ever seems to you that I value some dirt that we might inherit more than I value you, call me on it. Call me out and tell me that I have my priorities all messed up. And that seems to be what Jesus is warning about. It's a fairly common occurrence of pleonexia, of greed, to say, I want more. I want this resource more than I want this relationship. And it happens in inheritances, but it can also happen in our lives of business and commerce. And so Jesus tells us, take care. Be on your guard against that kind of greed. And we're trying to condition our children away from it, aren't we? Isn't that what we're fundamentally doing when we yell from the kitchen, share? Or when we walk into the room to be judge and arbitrator? I even say that sometimes to my kids. Look, guys, one day, Mom and I aren't going to be here to work these things out for you all. You're going to have to learn to find a way to live together in such a way that you can cooperate with each other. Look, guys, one day Mom and I aren't going to be around anymore. Your siblings are going to be who you have left from this family that we live in now. You're going to have to live together in a way that you can continue to love each other when Mom and Dad aren't there to hold it all together. I mean, this is your brother. This is your sister. Can't you value the love that you have for each other more than some silly toy that seems to be so important to you right now? That's what we're trying to teach our children. Value relationship more than you value that resource. So today, maybe you and I can take this lesson from Jesus to take care, to be on guard of that kind of selfishness and greed, which causes us to value resources more than relationships. But it gets even worse. The parable that Jesus tells, beginning in verse 16, the man in that parable is more tragic because he doesn't even seem to have any relationships. He seems to be so self-centered that he can't even see the existence of other people. You heard the story about how his land really produced, and so he had more than he needed, and he had to build bigger barns to hold on to more than that, and he keeps on planning for more and more until he finds out that one day he won't be there to enjoy it. But notice how self-centered this portion of the passage is. Go back and read it later. But just for example, reading in verse 17, he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns, and I will build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain." He's so self-centered that he even talks to himself. "I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry." That's a sad kind of pleonexia. Such self-centeredness that he can't even have relationships in the way that the brother has relationships. Now, most of us would consider that a caricature. That's taking the idea of greed and stretching it out to its farthest potential so that you can make everybody see how silly and ridiculous that kind of greed looks. But if I were a pulpit preacher, at this point, I would step down out of the pulpit and say to you that this is the place where I have the greater struggle. Not so much in valuing resources over relationships. I think I have pretty healthy relationships. But in being so drawn into self that I forget to look beyond my own interests and my own responsibilities. I mentioned a moment ago the 5 Jonas kids. I learned a couple of years ago that it doesn't pay to watch the news before you begin your day. In 2019, I think, because I know it was a time when there was not a forthcoming election, amen, they weren't talking about that on the news, but there was a story, of sort of a public interest story about finances, economics, home economics, in which the latest survey had indicated that nationwide it cost about $250,000 to raise a child from 0 to 18. Now, of course, that takes into account the whole nation, huge metropolitan areas, rural areas. In a lower cost of living place like our own, maybe it doesn't cost that much. But I remember looking over to Suzanne that morning and saying, "Well, hey, honey, we've got it made. All we need is $1.25 million, and we can raise these 5 children." And realize that was 0 to 18, no college involved. So you start to think about those responsibilities, and it starts to get pretty serious. Kids are expensive. Not just with those toys that are popular now and forgotten tomorrow, but the toys get bigger. I've got a child who's in college now. Tuition is expensive. I've got a child who got a driver's license this week. Lord, save us all. Car insurance is more expensive this week than it was last week. I have another child who will qualify for a driver's license in February. Lord, save us all again. And so those things start to mount up in a person's mind, and you start to think about, maybe I won't have enough. And you start to think about how you need to have a bigger barn to ensure that there's enough for tomorrow. And not only that, I receive a paycheck 2 times per month. I'm grateful for that. I thank God for that. And you know how those withholdings work in your paycheck. Some of those are for the common good, to pay for our roads, for our national defense, for our school teachers, for our school facilities, for things that are very worthwhile. And then some of those withholdings, in my case, go into a retirement and pension account. Here's where I struggle personally. I watch that retirement and pension account across the years, and I'm grateful that it grows. In good circumstances, it grows well across the years. But to what extent is that just building bigger and bigger barns? Now listen, I'm not asking anyone to meet me at the door and say, Jonathan, it's okay, we all do that. That's not really sinful, it's just being responsible. But I am pointing out that sometimes we can become concerned about providing for our own future to the extent that we forget to see the realities around us in other people's lives. My two sons, born in Guatemala, have given me a great love for that nation. I call it my country-in-law. And I've been there on several occasions, and almost every time that I'm there, a great sadness grips me because I realize that parents just like me in Guatemala who have 5 children aren't worried about spending $1.25 million to raise their child through age 18. And they're not worried about car insurance, and they're not worried about tuition, and they're not worried about so many things that I'm worried about. I say pretty often in my home and in my work, first world problems. Because some of those parents are worried about what they will eat during the winter. And while I'm building bigger and bigger barns, their concern is keeping their children alive and healthy. So when Jesus says, take care and be on guard against all kinds of greed, what I hear Jesus say to Jonathan is, maybe it is financially responsible to plan for the future, but don't become so concerned about building bigger and bigger barns for college tuition and for retirement and for other needs down the road that you forget that there are people living in literal need right now, just beyond your fingertips, just beyond your church walls, and certainly just beyond your national borders. One thing that I've consistently heard church people say across the years, here in our United Methodist Church, is that they have this concern that they could not in good conscience worship in a sanctuary or in a church in which they saw a pastor before them living in unrepentant sin. And most of the time they're talking about sexuality. But what if we're accidentally living in unrepentant sin by building these bigger and bigger and bigger barns while people struggle to survive around us? Again, I'm not asking for anyone to excuse me or to exonerate me, but I'm just sharing this struggle. And we dismiss that fairly quickly, but I want to point that out again. Societally, maybe we dismiss too quickly the things that we accept. That it is responsible for us to accumulate and gather to ourselves. That's good financial policy, we say. But it's also what Jesus uses as an illustration of warning. So I didn't come here this morning to make anyone feel guilty about your IRA. I didn't come here this morning intentionally to make anybody question whether you ought to save. But maybe what I did come here this morning to do is to say, if we're not thinking about those others who are struggling at the time that we're accumulating, that might be the pleonexia, the type of greed that Jesus warns us against. Maybe what I did come here today is to say to us, be on guard, just as Jesus said. Take care, just as Jesus said. Don't let greed sneak into your life, as Jesus said. And when we start to value a resource over a relationship, we need to have people in our lives who can call us out and say, you've got your priorities messed up. When we start to gather to ourselves to such an extent that we fail to notice those who are around us, when we have no relationship with anyone else in our accumulating for ourselves, be on guard, watch out, because that's a pleonexia that Jesus warns us about. I guess maybe what I intended to do today was to imagine that I'm standing over here in the kitchen, looking generally in this direction and simply saying, as Jesus says, share,